Guys, welcome back. We are slowly plowing our way through Genesis 1, and today we are looking at verses 3 and 4, not only because they go together, but as we progress, there's a pace that one becomes familiar with, and it becomes easier to spot almost the flow, the rhythm that we find within biblical Hebrew. But today, two short verses, verses 3 and 4, introduces the theme of light. And you will remember in the previous episode when we looked at verse 2, there was the theme of darkness that was introduced. The earth was formless and empty, formless and void. And then the scripture tells us that darkness was upon the faces, on the surfaces of the deep, of the abyss. And now it almost sounds as if Elohim is responding to that. The darkness is not good. This is not ideal. So we find Elohim saying, let light come to be. This is a command. This is a speak out. This is a creative, authoritative command. Let light come to be. And then it says, and light came to be. Verse 4, and Elohim saw the light, that it was good. And Elohim separated the light from the darkness. And then verse 5 continues with the same theme. But today, we're just going to pause and look at verses 3 and 4, look at the Hebrew, and see what can we extract from that. Let's dig straight into the Hebrew. I've got Genesis 1 verse 3 and Genesis 1 verse 4, both in tabular form, open right here in front of me. I'm going to read the Hebrew of verse 3. Vayomer Elohim YEHI or. Vayehi or. And then verse 4. Vara'a Elohim et ha'or ki tov. Let's read verse 3 again. Vayomer Elohim YEHI or. Vayehi or. Vara'a Elohim et ha'or ki tov. Can you hear there's a flow, there's almost a pattern established with all the vas. Vayomer Elohim YEHI or. Vayehi or. Vara'a Elohim et ha'or ki tov. A va in Hebrew, as we've mentioned in the previous episodes, is the conjunction meaning and in some rare cases meaning but. In this case, it continues to mean and what happens is there is a storytelling flow, there's a rhythm being established with all the and then this, and then God does, and then God responds, and then this, and then you see there's almost a flow-like, a pattern-like, a beautiful piece of Hebrew poetry being established. But let's look at verse 3. Vayomer starts with a vav conjunction, and then a curious thing, and this is a rule that I want us to pause for a second with. The verb yomer comes from the root verb amar, which is in the Kal perfect form, which means he said. Single male performed an action in the past and it's completed. That's what we call the Kal perfect form. Amar. But once you put a yod in front of a simple verb, it changes from a perfect tense to an imperfect tense. Now, an imperfect tense in Hebrew is the only other tense there is. You either get an action complete or an action incomplete. In other words, the action is being performed or the action is done. An imperfect or a perfect tense. So, a root word in the Kal perfect form, in other words, in the past tense, an action completed. Once you put a yod in front of that, and in this case, we have the root word amar, we put a yod in front of that, it becomes yomer. And yomer means he is saying. So God is saying, because following the verb is the subject, Elohim. But note the rule. When you have an imperfect verb, in other words, in the present continuous, in the ongoing tense, and you put a vav in front of an imperfect verb, it again becomes perfect. So, vayomer again means, and he said. If that wasn't the rule, there would have been written, and he is saying. Okay? But since the vav actually turns the tense of the verb around again, you get this almost twice turnaround. It says, Vayomer, and he said. That is the verb. It tells us, and he said. Who said that? Next word, Elohim. And we've covered Elohim. It's the masculine plural word for El. Elohim meaning powers, mighty ones, and our translation, God. Elohim. And now it gets really interesting. YEHI is another verb, called the JUSSIVE verb that is based on the simple form HAYAH, which means he existed. Okay, but in that form, it's almost a Hebrew imperative. A Hebrew imperative is a command. It's like when I tell you, run, with an exclamation mark, and you run, you react on a command, an instruction almost. So what happens here is, based on the verb HAYAH, YEHI, or, we find that Elohim is saying, exist, light. This is a command, this is an instruction. YEHI, or. It's almost as if God speaks into existence the light. YEHI, or, and then the word or is a masculine singular noun, which means light. YEHI, or, light, exist. And note, the translations always uses the words, let something be. This does not occur in Hebrew. You can't say in Hebrew, let something be. You give it an instruction, a command almost. So God says, light, exist, exclamation mark. And then it says, YEHI, or, and existed, light. Light exists, this is an instruction. And then the response is, and light existed. And curiously, uses the exact same inflection of the verb, the JUSSIVE form of the verb. Vayomer Elohim, and said Elohim, exist light. Vayehi, or, and light. It's almost as if light obeyed the voice of Elohim, and it came to be, it existed. And then verse 4, Vara'a Elohim et haor kitov. Very interesting phenomena. Here we find a similar rhythm with verse 3. Vayomer Elohim. Here we have Vara'a Elohim. But now the verb ra'a is in the perfect form. It's in the past tense. So the rule is as follows. When you have an imperfect verb, for example, yomer, which is in the present tense, if you may. Yomer, as in verse 3, vayomer. The yomer part is imperfect, and once you couple that with a vav, it definitely changes the tense. But when you couple a vav conjunction with a verb that is already in the perfect tense, in other words, in the past tense, for our English understanding, the tense remains the same. So, vayomer is an imperfect tense, means he says. But when you put a vav in front, it becomes he said. But ra'a is already in the perfect state. So it says, saw, he saw, and when I put a vav in front of that, it remains, and he saw. Does that make sense? So a present tense verb or an imperfect tense, when it gets a vav conjunction, the tense changes, swaps around. When it is already in the perfect tense, and I put a vav in front, it does not change back to the other tense. It remains perfect. It remains an action complete. Vara'a Elohim et direct object does not get translated as we've seen in the previous verses. Haor, the light. It has the prefix ha, which always means the definite article. And then ki is the conjunction that means because or that. God saw the light. That is good. Good is an adjective. Tov. And as we've mentioned in the past, Tov, although it gets translated as good, means functional. So God is saying here, he saw the light, came under his attention, that the light works. There's a theme of light and darkness playing off. And remember, we're still in the opening, we're still in the unfolding chapters of the creation narrative. But God is telling us very importantly, there was darkness upon the faces of the deep, verse 2. And here in verses 3 and 4, he says, God commands, he instructs light to exist. It's almost as if light is so within him and is so him that he speaks it into existence. And then he looks at this light, and we have no context other than that, and he sees that this is good, it's working. And this is very important because as the creation narrative unfolds, it's important for us to see the commentary that the author makes, but also the commentary that God makes on darkness is not okay. The light is important. I'm going to wrap up by reading it again. Vayomer Elohim, YEHI, or exist, light. Light exists. And light existed. Light obeyed the voice of God. And then Vara'a Elohim et haor kitov. And God saw the light, Haor, Kitov, that it was good, that it works, that it had a purpose. And this is important. This is the backdrop against which everything unfolds. And as I've mentioned in the past, the entire scriptural narrative is built on this conflict between light and darkness, but more so, the victory of light over darkness. And you see, God is just setting the table to say, I am the light. Light comes out of me, and it conquers the darkness. Be blessed.